This is the Arabic Hour. My name is Joe Hack, and I'm really honored to host this session, this conversation. You have as a guest Dr. Atif Qubrsi. When introducing Dr. Atif Qubrsi, I hesitate to introduce him because whatever I would say, it would fall short of his level of qualifications and what he has done to the whole world and in his socioeconomic analysis and his political analysis, etc. But I would like to welcome you, Dr. Qubrsi, to the Arabic Hour.
Thank you, Joe. You're a good friend, and thank you very much for a very generous introduction. I hope I can live up to that expectation you've created.
Well, you've never failed us. You've always outdid our expectations, and we're honored. Let's get into the topic. I did hear your lecture, very, very valuable, informative lecture on the war in Ukraine, and I think that's the focus they're talking about, a war in Ukraine. But it looks like it's more of a global war. And I really listened to a lot of the questions that came from people from all over, like from Brazil, from Egypt, from Canada, from the US, from all over the place. And they were very pointed questions, and some had different points of view. Since you delivered that lecture, Dr. Qubrsi, has anything changed? Has anything developed that you are in a different opinion, or is your conviction fortified and strengthened by what you said before?
Yeah, excellent question. Certainly, the war was predictable. I mean, this was my original hypothesis.
Yes.
That this is a war that could have been avoided, but the factors that were building up that brought about this violent and devastating war was in the making for many years. From the day the Soviet Union was dissolved and the Berlin Wall had tumbled down, there were a general agreement that Russia would allow German unification, would not stand in its way. And there were about 400,000 Soviet troops in East Germany, and they were pulled out. And the Russians acquiesced to the reunification of Germany, subject to a promise that has become now more and more evident, that NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization forces, would not move east, that they would not expand to take membership into East Europe that used to be members of the Warsaw Pact or members of the Soviet Union. Yes. And that really allowed the Russians to feel comfortable about acquiescing and accepting and not objecting and moving their troops so that Germany could be unified. Only to find out that NATO started moving east into Poland, into Hungary, into Czechoslovakia, into the Czech Republic, and then ultimately came so close, inviting Ukraine, which is literally in the back garden, so to speak, of Russia. And then only have to remember, when the 1960s, early 60s, the Soviets were trying to bring some missiles to Cuba, and the United States were very adamant about not feeling comfortable allowing nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles in their backyard. And that this is extremely similar, so to speak, the agony of the Russians to having NATO and nuclear weapons again and ballistic missiles right at the border, so to speak, of Russia. And it could have been avoided, so to speak, because the Russians, as they felt comfortable that they had thwarted or argued in a way that persuaded the NATO forces in the West not to advance east. And here they are now knocking at the doors. So that to a great extent, this war was predictable. I mean, Russia had made it very clear and very loud, saying that NATO had to stop, cannot come to the Ukrainians, and if it comes to the Ukraine, there will be a war. So,
Yes.
in some sense, yeah.
If I don't want to interrupt you at all, but just to support your point, I had heard at least two former Pentagon generals who have stated exactly what you've stated, Dr. Kouroussi, that look, this war can be stopped if Biden can say we guarantee that Ukraine will not join NATO and we will demilitarize it, you know what, from antagonistic weapons, and that war could be stopped. The second general said, and I think I want your comment on it, said, look, I think the Americans are ready to fight to the last Ukrainian in Ukraine. Stop giving the Ukrainians weapons because you are killing them. Yeah. But the world seems to be, I mean, recently, look at Davos, you know that the Germans and everybody else, they said what Putin did is equal to what triggered the First World War. What do you think of this vision, the Third World War?
Well, the war, as I said, was predictable in the sense that there is no question here that the advancement and the expansion, the intention of NATO to incorporate Ukraine into the NATO system considered to be quite provocative and quite threatening to the national security of Russia. The story is that even probably worse is that 2014 is a period where there was a, so to speak, a coup d'etat in which the pro-Russian government in Ukraine was replaced by an anti-Russian government through a coup d'etat, and the Americans admitted they spent about $6 billion to re-engineer and support the transformation of the Ukraine from being a member of the family of Russia and the Russian system being and the Russian concerns being taken into account, into being if not an enemy, but it was no longer as accommodating and was to a great extent pursuing policies that the Russians considered to be hostile. So the story of these generals, talking about is generally true. The story is even worse in the sense that there were incredible amounts of money and weapons that have been showered on Ukraine from 2014 onward. It started with about $6 billion in 2014 in terms of weapons. The United States today, actually, or yesterday, Senator Paul Rand came out strongly saying that if this money that the United States is spending so profligately on supporting the Ukrainians, military support for the Ukrainians was spent on some of the social and economic and other programs, it would have solved lots of American problems. Why is the U.S. Supporting and spending this? This seems like the U.S. had some objectives that they wanted from this war that some have suspected, including these generals, who said that the U.S. seems to be willing to fight to the last Ukrainian person in order to get these objectives in place. And what are these objectives, one would ask? Well, one, you see, the U.S. is very happy to bleed and to drain the Russian economy, apparently, and the Russian military system. And Ukraine fight and the war is proving to be an effective way, unfortunately, for draining the Russians in terms of material, people, and resources. The other one is that the United States has lost, especially under President Trump, the control it had, or the hegemonic control they had over Europe. Europe was deviating and taking some independent actions. The last manifestation of this was Nord Stream, where Europe, particularly Germany, became more dependent on Russian gas and oil. And whole Europe, Italy too, and many other countries. Actually, some people really say that 48% of the total consumption of natural gas in Europe came from Russia, and about around the 20%, if not more, even some people have estimated 25% of the crude oil or refined oil also came from Russia. So to some extent, that close relationship that Merkel and others had developed with Russia, trying to bring Russia more to Europe or accommodating, was considered by the US to be at their expense, and that and somehow it diluted, it weakened the American influence and presence in Europe. The Ukraine war gave the Americans the chance to reestablish, as you can see, their hegemonic control over Europe. Now even Nordic European countries like Finland and Sweden that did not really want to be part of NATO, now they're beginning to demand that they want to be members. And this definitely reestablished NATO as a European American project at the time when the European side was not really this. And the third one is that the Russian economy is the 11th economy in the world, and all these sanctions and all these programs that they put to impose an economic cost on Russia is not going to be effective, or is not that really viable, because, as I said, the Russian economy is not the most important economy. The real target here is, with these major embargoes and sanctions, is to scare the Chinese. The Chinese economy is the largest trading economy in the world, $6 trillion, and that these sanctions are telling the Chinese, hey, listen, guys, what we're doing to the Russians, and maybe it's not proving to be as effective, it's going to be very costly for you, and you better behave. So these three reasons, and there are about two other reasons, like the military-industrial complex in the United States, and that this, military-industrial complex looks for wars. I mean, this is the only way to justify that huge amount of money. The United States budget, defense budget, is larger than the entire world spent on defense.
Speaking of targets, I've read some excellent analysis by foreign policy and Europeans and Middle Eastern writers to say, well, the actual target is not Russia, it's China. The US is trying to encircle China because China is the tiger that the US fears most because of the economy and because of the advancement in weapons. Do you feel that this is a step forward to encircle China, and are they going to be able to do that?
Well, I doubt it, and the world is not going to be as peaceful or as comfortable or as hospitable to the conflict that is brewing in the Pacific. As you can tell, that the Americans have made no bones about it, and they have, created AUKUS, what they call it, Australia, United Kingdom, and the Americans, and creating major military moves and presence in the Pacific, targeting China. The story is quite complex here, and as you said, Joe, Russia is not such an economic threat or competitor to the Americans. They're nowhere there. It's an economy that depends primarily and almost exclusively on military weapons and oil and gas. The challenge is China. And the worry here is that this conflict in China is throwing and making something unusual. It has never been the American strategy. Actually, the Kissinger strategy was to extricate China from Russia. And even Trump was trying to really, cozy up to the Russians to extricate them from China. Under President Biden, it looks that the US is trying to take the Russians and the Chinese at the same time. And many people felt that this is probably not a very smart way. But the argument was coming, all right, the stronger we go against both, the closer Europe feels closer to us. So in some sense, the world is far more dangerous today than it was yesterday. And the fact that the Europeans and the Americans are now on a advanced stage of conflict with the Russians and the Chinese, indirectly the Chinese, the world is a lot more risky, and the nuclear confrontation seems to be in the background, and it has not worried people as it should. The real political pundits in the West, generals and other people, are beginning to speak up and saying, hey, this conflict doesn't seem to have an end in sight, and then the longer it remains and the greater involvement of China is going to really be quite dangerous. I mean, just a few days back, President Biden said, if China attacks Taiwan, we would intervene militarily. Intervene, in, what does it mean? This is not a traditional war. This is not a conflict that could remain under control. The trouble is that all these parties to the conflict are all nuclear powers, and God knows whether this is going to build up towards a nuclear confrontation and a third world war. And the worries are real, and they are quite devastating. Political analysts like Noam Chomsky and many others, Christopher Hedges, had warned that if we continue this road, there is one certain result. That is going to be a devastating war. And nuclear war will be the last war because it could destroy the planet.
Everybody will lose. Let us switch our attention to the Middle East. As you are, and everyone is aware that the war has sifted the countries where some of them pretended to be friends of Russia. But I think right now many of the countries crystallized their real, if you will, connection to Russia, whether they're on their side or not on their side, particularly in the Middle East, like Turkey and Israel. And I don't want to talk about some of the Arab countries. Do you feel that Russia's strategy towards the Middle East, because of what I just said, and specifically their position on Syria, because let's face it, Israel attacks Syria all the time, and there's Russian troops there, and they don't seem to respond. And everybody says, why? So the question is two-pronged. One is, do the country is Russia going to change its strategy? And the second part is Russia in Syria going to, if you will, highlight its presence by preventing those daily attacks on the Syrian people?
I mean, these are really important questions and serious questions. One of the important developments about this war is that it is a world war. I mean, the whole world is affected. Yeah. The story is that it couldn't have come at a worse time. The war came with all its negative economic impact and other political tensions on the heel of COVID. that had wrecked the world economy and created major disruptions to supply chains and to the globalized world that we knew. All of a sudden, countries were caught up having more weapons and guns than they have ventilators, and could not get their personal protective gear from their neighborhood, and had to depend on getting it from China or other Far Eastern countries. The story is that the world is now totally implicated, and the impacts are global, are not local. Look at the price of energy. I mean, the interruption of the supply chain, and Europe is trying to extricate itself from being heavily dependent on Russian gas and oil, is making it extremely precarious situation, where price of oil is now $120 per barrel, when it was during COVID only $20, 6 times. And now there are predictions, incredible prediction, that suggest that this price might really go to $150, which means there might be the price of a liter would be $3, and the price of a gallon could really go, to about $12. I mean, it's a very ugly scenario, and people. We're still captive markets for transportation and many other aspects to oil and gas. We need to heat our houses or generate electricity. The renewable energy are not proving to be as viable alternatives, particularly at this time, and therefore the world is caught dependent on oil and gas, and the prices of these are rising at incredible rates and affecting every person, because everybody drives to work or for their trips or for their shopping, and the story is that inflation is now at record high levels. Like in the United States, it is 8 point something, 8.3, which is the highest for the past 40 years. In Canada, 6 point something, and is higher than it was since the 1980s or last 70s. So the story is that worse than it, the price of food. I mean, people have to eat, and then and you talk about Middle East. Middle East imports more than 50% of its wheat from Ukraine and China. And now that these are not available, not only they are very costly, but they're not available. So there is really here a situation where the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization is predicting that there may be famines, and that there would be places and areas in the world, and Middle East is one of them, where they might not have bread, and fertilizers are so expensive now because they're all gas or oil based, and when they're available, they're too costly for people to
yes. How about again? I don't want to interrupt you. I think that the second part of the question was, do you think Russia will change its strategy regarding some of the countries in the Middle East, like Turkey and Israel and Syria and the whole area? Because some of them really, they showed that they give Russia the nice face, but in the back they were stabbing Russians, like the Turks, like the Israelis.
Well, it has already changed. Okay. I had predicted in that lecture that you alluded to that Israel and Russia were on a collision course, and they did. To a great extent, Israel tried to play both sides, but then the Americans really called them into question, and it seems like the first casualty in this war outside is the Israeli-Russian relationship. Russia had turned a blind eye as long as they attacked the Iranian forces and Hezbollah and others in Syria, and they really prevented the Syrians from using Russian weapons to respond. For the first time last week, the Russians had allowed and given permission to the Syrians to use the S-300, and there's some talk that they might really bring into the region. The S-400 that they had given to Turkey may really put in Syria. So to some extent, that unchallenged Israeli control of the skies over Syria are no longer there. They are coming of the past. So there is definitely a repercussion here. The Russian-Israeli accommodation and implicit understanding, or they call it, the security arrangement, I think has been torpedoed by this war. The other one is Turkey is playing the two sides, but how long can they really play the two sides? NATO, Turkey is a member of NATO and has objected, for example, to the admission of Finland and Sweden, and now they're meeting, and who knows what would be the price that Turkey would be able to exact on the Swedes and the Finnish and the rest of the NATO countries to expand it. To a great extent, what we're really having here is a very precarious situation that all the established agreements and modus operandi, the way things were run before the war of Ukraine, are now casualties of this war. And if they have not really become casualties already, they are likely to become casualties. And that's one of the major implications for the Middle East. Because as Russia now is extricating itself from any accommodation with Israel, it really is going to make the Israelis a lot less free in their movement. And increasingly, the Turks are beginning to irritate the Russians, and they cannot remain members of NATO and accommodating and buying weapons from Russia. They bought the S-400, and the story is likely to become a more complex situation. And there are many pundits and political analysts who believe that the Russian-Turkish relationship is on that chopping.
Yeah, well, that's great. Let me narrow the focus a little bit more. Recently, in the past few months, we've heard many Russian authorities, whether it's military or political, speak specifically about the Palestinians, specifically about how the Palestinians are struggling for their national rights and for their human rights, and how badly they have been treated by Israel. Whereas before, we sort of did not hear that kind of emphatic expression from the Russians about the Palestinians. Now, we know that's happening because our people in Palestine are showing their heroic stance and the steadfastness against the atrocities of the Zionists and what they're doing. But there seems to be a Russian shift towards even Palestine and Israel. Do you see that happening?
Absolutely. I mean, the relationship of the Russians and the Israelis were not just simply about what the Israelis do or don't do over Syria. But the Russians have always been supporters of the Palestinians, but have turned a blind eye sometimes to some of the trespasses and the infractions of the Israelis of international
crimes
and international law. Now the unraveling of the relationship between Israel and Russia is going to put Russia far more vocal and supportive of the Palestinians. This is definitely one of the outcomes that one can expect, and is beginning to become more evident on the ground. The way the Russians are now voting in the UN, and some of their declarations have become more vocal and more unequivocal in their support of the Palestinians, particularly after the Human Rights Watch and the Amnesty International has called the Israeli practices in Palestine and in the occupied territories and in the Israel 1948 apartheid crimes. There is definitely here a situation in which the Palestinians are going to gain a lot more vocal support from the Russians. The Palestinians' economy is suffering from the war too, because most of their wheat and sunflower and fertilizers were to a great extent bought through Israel, but Israel buying from Ukraine and Russia. So already the price of wheat is 4 times in the occupied territories that were really before this war. So to a great extent, there is really some direct fallout on the Palestinian economy from this conflict. On the economic side, on the political side, there is a fallout, and the fallout is in proportion to the dissatisfaction and unhappiness of Russia, of the positions that the Israelis have taken and weapons that they have been sending and military trainers they have really sent, is going to translate with some more positive position and support, and it could even go to more than just declarations, to some overt
more effective movements towards the Palestinians rather than just talk before.
Already that there is a shift that you can notice it in what Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, have declared, and other people. But the story is, and this remains to be seen, is how much there would be a change on the ground in terms of economic, military, and other support.
Speaking of Palestine and Palestinians, I'm sure you would be happy to know we're this coming Sunday, the 29th, we're having a memorial mass for the heroic martyr Shireen Abu Akleh at the Maronite Church in Edmonton. And the whole community is participating because this Shireen Abu Akleh, I very humbly, in an article I wrote about her, I compared her to Jeanne d'Arc or Jeanne d'Arc, who turned the battles between the French and the English towards victory for the French. And she did phenomenal change in the if you will, courage, and the French went out and won very, very many battles. I think Shireen, in my very humble view, has triggered the Palestinian, a lot more Palestinian nationalists, even from young people who are 14, 15, 16. They are right now fighters. They are not sitting just there watching and throwing stones. They're in the actual war against apartheid and against occupation. So I just want to tell you, and I'm sure you'd be happy, and the audience, that there's a major shift even in the communities abroad, including in Canada, as you very well know, that Shireen Abu Akleh has invigorated that nationalist feeling, and we hope that in July we will be having another get together, and we hope we can have the honor of your presence on the 8th of July to come and visit us.
Oh, it would be a pleasure, and you're absolutely right. And thank you, Joe, and thank you, the community in Edmonton, for holding this mass in recognition of the murder and the martyrdom of Shireen Abu Akleh. She's an American citizen, after all, not just only Palestinian. And she was murdered in cold blood. And even the CNN has now come up with evidence showing that it could have not been killed except by Israeli fire, and that this firing was not random or it just happened as a collateral or side effect. It was targeted killing of this fantastic, iconic journalist in doing her own job. This was a very despicable situation. And if this was not enough, Joe, they attacked the sanctity of the funeral march. The pallbearers were clubbed and they remained steadfast and carrying her corpse. I mean, this was, the coffin was not dropped despite all the vicious and violent attack that the Israelis so wantingly had perpetrated against the funeral of this real, incredibly effective journalist who was doing in the normal course of doing her job. This attack on the press by Israel is not the first one. They had already murdered 45 journalists, and a couple of them from Al Jazeera. This is really something that, as you have noted, have shaken the conscience of the world and has galvanized the Palestinian struggle, and the incredible crimes that apartheid has meted on these people. They're protected by the UN Geneva Convention and other international agreements, conventions on how you deal with occupied people, and then you get this situation in broad daylight in the front of the world. Like it was not something hidden or something they tried to obfuscate and pretend that this was really murdered by random Palestinian things. And now the CNN evidence is great. What is really needed here in Canada and the United States is that for these countries to champion and to, give credibility to their positions. You cannot keep saying that you are for the human rights of people, and then you completely disappear when people are calling for an international independent verification of this crime. And it's this cultural impunity that Israel lives under, where they can murder people. I mean, look, if the world had come and condemned the Israelis for attacking worshippers in one of the holiest Muslim places, this would have never happened. But the world silence has created a situation of complicity with Israeli crimes and the willingness to completely remain indifferent and silent on holding Israel accountable. And the war in Ukraine, to relate this to, is incredibly here. Okay, the occupation of Russian occupation of Ukraine is condemnable. And, people stood and were happy to condemn it. But what about the 74 years of massacres of Palestinians, of, demolishing their homes, of incarcerating young people, of murdering their people? I mean, this is incredible. There were many people in the US and other places who were completely unhappy about this, but this is not translated in any concrete way, where these countries that espouse and keep talking about how strongly and adamantly they are for people freedom to express themselves and to choose inalienably the inalienable right to self-determination. Why is it, to blonde and blue-eyed Ukrainians, but not to the Palestinian people?
Yeah. Yes.
They believe that the war has completely blew the top over this completely biased way of looking at things. Human rights are indivisible, and they do not change by one's birth or color, eyes or otherwise. And the world is becoming really intolerant of this hypocrisy and double standards.
I don't know how much more time we have. I mean, this is so enjoyable. We can go on for, because you're so informative, and it's and you're talking to us about the macro and the micro, and God bless you. The expertise and the knowledge is just tremendous and commendable. I just wanted to speak a little bit very quickly about the Canadian situation. We know, you and I, that there is a a leadership race for the Conservative Party, and many of the candidates are coming out west. And these are the kinds of pointed questions that we have prepared. When they come here, whether it's Charest or Polivier or whoever, what is your stance on the human rights, on what's going on, the mockery of what is called the human rights in Israel compared to the human rights that you talk about in Ukraine? I don't know. I mean, we're in the West, and you know that the West is very conservative, but at the same time, I speak to people on the street. We speak to friends that we have at the universities, government, etc. There's a lot of, if you will, disgruntlement with the position that Canada is taking towards. We're fine with what they're doing for Ukraine, except for the weapons, etc. But a lot of people are saying to Justin Trudeau, our Prime Minister, you cannot have you cannot have human rights in Ukraine, but no human rights in Palestine. So we're really getting prepared for this, and obviously we will call on you for help and guidance. And I hope that the people who listen to this very, very informative conversation, they'll come out with some knowledge, some more information about what's happening. And hopefully we can follow with another get together with you. It's always an honor and a pleasure. And you know, I still have many, many questions, but in the interest of time, and we know that you have appointments coming up right away, I would like to give you the forum for the last words. What would you like to say? And we will conclude.
I mean, you said it all, Joe, and I am really happy with the way you've really put it forward here. Canada is now guilty of silence, complicity, and unwillingness to challenge the Israelis. We have called in Canada and we've asked our representative to demand, and there were also Salma Zahid and other MPs in the Parliament of Canada who called on the government to ask for an independent international investigation of this crime and to challenge Canada on becoming consistent. You cannot be for human rights in Ukraine but not in Palestine. You cannot stand for human rights for the whites but not for the blacks. You cannot be for the citizens but not the natives. The issues of complicity, the issue of double standards, the issue of racism has become a rallying point in Canada as it's in the United States, as it is in the rest of the world, that the world has to stand clear and clean on these issues, and that we become more credible and we become more believable the extent to which we show consistency. You cannot really call for the rights of some people, but not the others. Human rights, as I said, is indivisible. And therefore, if there is one person in the Himalayas or in the backwaters of Africa or any place in the world, it's our collective humanity that is...
Or downtown Toronto.
And it's the collective humanity that is the issue here. And we shine only when we stand together and we are consistent and feel that the abuse of human rights of any person, no matter where they are, is an abuse of right, wherever we are.
Well, I'm so thankful. As I said at the beginning, I want to repeat to say that I'm so thankful to the Arabic Hour for given me the pleasure and real, as I said, honor to conduct this very, very valuable, informative interview. I know that the guest was fantastic, and I hope I was at a certain level there of efficiency. But we thank you so much, and we wish you the best, because you have other appointments coming up, and we know that. But we look forward to the next interview, and we hope that this will take place very, very, very soon. Thanks very much, Dr. Kulbers.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you for an excellent interview. Thanks.